Chapter 4 covers ethical issues. One of the reasons that this is an independent study chapter is because ethical issues are covered pervasively throughout your undergraduate education. Many of you had first degrees that had lots of coverage on what ethics look like, and then you came in to your ABSN program and also had an introduction to bioethics and ethics in nursing. So we're going to go through this chapter pretty quickly with the focus on what it means to have ethical practice from a leadership standpoint. I want you to remember that the common ethics terms, the vocabulary, the type of definitions that are related to ethics, all of that is fair game on a test. What is included in your book chapter does an ideal job of giving you what you need. I'm not going to go through all the vocabulary in this voiceover, but know that you're going to be accountable for knowing what words mean and what types of ethical principles are out there and be able to differentiate between those. In class, we're going to talk about current ethical situations. So before class, I'd like you to spend a few minutes jotting down current ethical issues, and we're going to talk about those in class because they're important. I want you to be able to really understand that nurses are agents of ethics. We are placed in situations where we are expected to be agents for our patients, our physicians, and our organization simultaneously. So all of those populations could have conflicting needs, wants, and goals. We really are at the crux of navigating, collaborating, and coordinating ethical practice. So I want you to be thinking about what that looks like for you from first a bedside nursing perspective, and then start to think about what is your role as an advocate for ethical behavior from a leadership role. Organizational culture matters, folks. I want you to think about the definition as being the sum of an organization's values, languages, traditions, customs, and sacred cow things that are not open to discussion or change. It's the way of thinking, behaving, and believing that are common in members of an organization. And healthcare especially has some very clear, pervasive organizational cultures. Brune in 2005 wrote that it is often the interaction of the culture of the organization and the character of the leader that create ethical failure. And what that means is that the culture that a leader is working in does not support ethical behavior, or the other way around, that there's an ethical work culture, but it is not implemented effectively by a leader. It's that conflict between the culture and the leader in whichever direction it's going that causes an ethical failure. And as leaders, we're accountable for our role in that. So I want you to be mindful of that. The management challenge, because it's personal, organizational, subordinate, and consumer responsibilities differ, there is a great potential for managers and leaders to experience interpersonal conflict. When we think about the role of a manager and a leader, ideally, we're going to have an individual who functions effectively as a leader and a manager. It is not two separate people. There are times organizationally that you will have someone that is an organizational leader but is not a manager in a formal sense. When you think about those roles of managing an organizational culture and ethics and leading ethics, a manager makes ethical decisions in a methodical, thoughtful, ethical manner. A leader is going to role model ethical behaviors. So ideally, if those two roles of manager and leader are squished together, you've got a single individual that role models ethical behavior in all of their leadership practices and uses that role modeling to kind of be the hands and feet of ethics and implementing ethical decision making for their team. Competencies for managing ethical decision as a nurse manager require us to have knowledge of ethical principles and frameworks, use a professional approach that eliminates trial and error and focuses on a proven decision-making model. That takes you back to chapter 1. And use available organizational processes to assist in making each decision. So again, it's gathering as much information as possible from a variety of sources, bringing them together, analyzing them, and the focus being a ethical decision that benefits the person or people that are involved. These are different types of ethical issues. I'm not going to spend time reading this slide. I do want you to understand the vocabulary on this slide and be able to differentiate between the groups of definitions. I do want to remind you that ethics and morals are different. Ethics tend to be more established and broadly accepted, where morals are a belief system and are very personal. There are often overlaps that our morals define our ethics. So I want you to be able to differentiate between it just personally, not from an academic standpoint, but I want you to think about, what do I believe as an individual that are personal to me, and how do they play out in ethical decisions? And can I remain objective so that I don't take my morals and project them into an ethical decision that hijacks the outcome or alters the outcome in a way that I believe is favorable, but doesn't actually advocate for the people involved, whether it's patients or staff out at the unit level. This is the focus on management's ethical responsibilities. I think this slide is pretty straightforward. I do want you to, this ethical framework, your 4.1 from your book, I want you to be able to define these four and be able to understand what they mean. These are your vocabularies for principles of ethical decision making. These principles invariably get folks tangled up, so I want you to spend some time reviewing these definitions and be familiar with them. You will see them again. NCLEX also likes these, so please don't try to memorize them for their purpose here and think they're going away. They'll be back. Ethics committees are super important. Again, it goes back to having as many people at the table to gather as many perspectives so that when a decision is made, all perspectives are covered. A key component of a good ethics committee is the involvement of the affected person. And if you are a bedside nurse leader, let's say you're charge unit in an intensive care unit, and you've got an ethical decision that you need to make, you're going to get a variety of perspectives. The most important perspective is to have the family member or the individual involved in helping define an ethical decision. They have to be at the table, folks. Your Code of Ethics is in your book on display 4.3. Understand that the Code of Ethics is patient-centered. It covers the nurse's responsibility for safe work environments, and it explores the nurse having a duty to him or herself. The scope and standards of nursing administration, which is in your book at 4.4, specifically Standard 12 deals with ethics and ethical leadership behavior. I don't want you to memorize these. I want you to know that they're out there, and that that the scope and standards and the Code of Ethics exist to help us function at our highest standard of ethical practice. So be mindful of, this isn't a minimum standard. This is the best of the best. When we are practicing ethically, we are at the highest standard of ethical practice for nurses, and that is what is expected of professional nurses. Ethical dilemmas. I think this slide does a pretty good job of defining those. What I would encourage you to do is to be aware. I think in chapter 1 we explored ways that we can use decision-making tools. Remember that we do have a traditional problem-solving methods. We have the nursing process. We also have the mnemonic moral decision-making model, which is on the next slide, which we're going to cover. To avoid an error in ethical problem solving, our approach needs to be structured, adequate data, and have multiple alternatives. That gives us the best possible opportunity to pick the ethical solution that is oriented to the affected population. Again, whether you're a bedside nurse leader and you're advocating an ethical outcome for your patient, or whether you're a unit manager or an executive leader, we all want the best possible outcome, and how you do that is a methodical, data-filled, multiple alternative solution approach. Here's the moral decision that I mentioned a few moments ago. I do want you to be mindful of this. I want you to understand that when we talk about a model approach to ethical decision making, our M stands for massaging the dilemma. And all that means is we're collecting as much data about the ethical problem and who should be involved. This is when we figure out what the problem is and start inviting people to the table. The O is to outline the options. We're going to analyze the options, the pro and cons of each. We're going to make lists. We're going to use Post-it notes. We're going to debate back and forth. The R stands for reviewing criteria and resolve. And this is going back to your pro and con list and weighing the options and the value of all those options. And the A is make an affirmed position and act. And what that means is we're going to develop and implement a plan. We've already gotten all of our options. We've looked at the pros and cons. We've analyzed what happens if we do this. And now we're going to develop a plan of action. We're going to affirm the position and we're going to act. And the last thing that is so critical and goes back to our nursing practice is we're going to look back. That means we're going to evaluate the decision making we did. Did what we said we were going to do from an ethical perspective actually come to bear? Was the outcome what we intended for the patient or for the unit or for the department? I want you to be familiar with this mnemonic and what each of these sections mean. Strategies to promote ethical behavior as a norm. This is pretty straightforward. I want you to be able to discern that there is, be able to separate legal and ethical issues and understand that they can be different and that they don't always merge. We use an institutional review board when we are doing research that involves people to make sure that our behavior is ethical. And we'll talk about the IRB later in another chapter, but I do want to highlight that there. This is a great reminder of legal and ethical. If we're in the top left box, we're legal and ethical. What this means is that we are complying with the Nurse Practice Act. That is our guide to legal and ethical behaviors that keep us out of trouble. The right bottom corner, the illegal and unethical, that is related to things that will get us in jail and get us sued civilly for malpractice. So these corners are you're doing things exactly how you're supposed to be doing, or the other one you're going to jail and you're going to be in debt to somebody because you're going to be sued. Let's look at the other two options. Illegal and ethical. Let me give you an example. The medicinal use of marijuana. Most states still have it as illegal, but there is a huge amount of research that addresses the compassionate, appropriate medical use of marijuana for chronic pain, for neurological disorders, for side effects of chemotherapy. You cannot argue the value of the medicinal use of a compassionate drug, but it's still illegal. So that's an example. Let's go to the legal and unethical, the left bottom. There are things that are legal that may be unethical. Let me give you an example. There was a case in, I believe it was Florida, with an assisted living facility. There was a licensed vocational nurse, or what we call an LPN, licensed professional nurse, who was providing care in the assisted living facility. Their policy says that they are a community-based setting, and that if there was a medical emergency, that their response, as it would be in a community, would be to call 911 and be present with the individual, that they would not provide any kind of medical intervention because they're in the community. Outside one of the assisted living homes, an elderly woman collapsed on the sidewalk. The LPN contacted 911, told them that the woman was unresponsive and needed assistance, and called for an ambulance. The person on 911 asked if she was breathing. The client on the sidewalk was not. The woman asked the LPN if she knew CPR and if she did begin it. And the LPN stated to the 911 dispatcher that by her policy, she was not allowed to perform any kind of medical intervention if the client, because the client was located in the assisted living section of their department. So long and short, there was no intervention. There was no CPR provided to the elderly client who was lying on a sidewalk outside the facility, and the client, the elderly woman, died. The LPN was not terminated. Her license was not negatively impacted because their policies, and the state treated this as a community setting where people are not obligated to intervene, or they're not supposed to. It was a hot mess. It was a lengthy article. There was a civil suit, and I'm fairly sure the woman was found civilly liable. So while she didn't lose her license and didn't wind up in professional timeout, I believe she was sued and found liable civilly because she did not do anything that would have been appropriate and reasonable considered her training. So you have something that was perceived to be legal, and any nurse would argue was completely unethical. Okay, folks, that does it. I'll look forward to talking with you in class about these topics.